Julia.
The clutching of pearls that has gone on by not just a whole bunch of lovies, lots of political supporters of the BBC, and some of their most highly paid stars, yes, you, Gary Lineker and others, has been quite extraordinary. Anyone would think that Nadine Dorries had announced that the firstborn child of everyone working at the BBC was to be executed or taken away from them, and that the entire BBC headquarters was to be burnt to the ground, rather than a freeze on their £3.5 billion budget.
It's complete hysteria. It's like it really demonstrates the extent to which they treat the BBC as a religion, as a temple, as the place that has all the solutions to the world's problems, and anything that interferes with the BBC, they interpret it as an attack on their way of life. So they really do see the BBC as playing that role. And so the response has been completely hysterical. Nadine Dorries is making some sensible proposals. This is not cultural vandalism. And also the world has changed enormously since the BBC was founded. We now have subscription services. Lots of people don't watch terrestrial TV. They watch Netflix and other things like that. So things have changed. The world has changed. The BBC needs to catch up, and the BBC's fans need to calm down.
Yeah, absolutely. And this idea, well, we're going to have to cut some programming. I mean, okay, can I give you a list of things that I don't watch? And indeed, according to the stats, pretty much no one watches. The reality is TV, I mean, I'm about the youngest age group that does watch the BBC anymore. Yeah, I like a bit of Strictly. There's a few comedy panel shows on BBC Two. Got to be honest with you, that's pretty much it from me. I very rarely watch BBC News. I read their website, occasionally listen to a couple of their radio stations. But there's this idea that they produce something unbelievably unique and amazing that simply would not be replicated in the commercial world. I mean, have they not ever seen Netflix? Have they not ever seen any rival news channels?
And that's exactly the point. And the BBC does quite well on the commercial market. You know, it sells programs around the world. It does well. So it can definitely go further down that route. But I think a lot of the people who worship the BBC, they don't realize how it doesn't impact on other people's lives in the same way. So, for example, I often tell the story of the fact that I had never heard of the Archers until I was 19 years old. Yeah. And a middle-class girl in a pub mentioned it to me, and I said, what's that? So all the things that they take for granted as being part of the cultural furniture, it's not the case for lots of people.
Oh, this is totally true. And this is the thing, a lot of these people working at the BBC and the big defenders of the BBC, as you say, they live in this completely sort of isolated bubble. And we saw that, didn't we, over Brexit? The shocked faces of the newsroom staff the night that we won the referendum. I say we because you and I were both prominent Brexit campaigners, was fascinating to watch, because it wasn't that they were disappointed. I mean, it's extraordinary that the bias in that newsroom was so great on one side, but they didn't know anybody other than apparently some working class racist people they met doing a vox pop once in Scunthorpe who actually backed Brexit. So they were completely stunned by this result.
Exactly right. And after that, they became the Brexit bashing corporation. They were really down on Brexit, and they couldn't understand why so many Brits had voted for it. And I think what that really demonstrated is that, I think it's a good idea to have a public broadcaster, to have a broadcaster that stands slightly above everyone else. But the BBC has failed as a public broadcaster because it doesn't understand the public. It doesn't speak to the public. And very often these days, it lectures and hectors the public by telling them they're stupid. White men are ignorant. White women are all Karens. Brexit was a disaster. You're all a bunch of idiots. And it has this very disdainful approach to the public. Yeah. That's an anti-public broadcaster. Yeah. So it needs to ask itself, why does it exist, and why are we being forced to pay for it?
And indeed, and again, whether it's news, whether it's children's program, whether it's a wildlife documentary, whether it's entertainment, they need to put in sort of liberal agenda propaganda on everything, whether it's about climate crisis or emergencies, insist on calling it, whether it's about correct pronouns for transsexuals. I mean, it doesn't matter what it is. There is the politics of the BBC staff runs through every single aspect of BBC programming. And it just is not reflected in the general view of people in this country, even though, bizarrely, they're not all transphobic, misogynistic, racists.
Absolutely, and the best example of that is the natural programs that the BBC puts out, which are world class.
Mm,
I absolutely adore those programs, especially David Attenborough's ones, which, like everyone else, I've been watching my whole life.
yeah.
But in recent years, they've just become these really quite dull and worthy lectures to the public. Every single story is
Yeah.
really a story about what a poisonous impact on the planet humankind is having. So even the wonderful scientific stuff that the BBC makes has to be infused with this dinner party politics that the
Yes.
BBC is addicted to. So
Totally.
it's that problem. People feel quite dislocated from the BBC, I think, because they think that they're constantly being talked down to. So if the BBC is not a public broadcaster, it should play on the same playing field as the other
Well,
broadcasters
indeed.
do.
I mean, again, I'm like you. I agree that I still want to have a public funded BBC, but I want it to be much more. There's no need for the BBC to produce Radio One. I mean, I'm sorry. There's the choice of radio stations now is extraordinary. I mean, when I explained to my daughter that there was only Radio One, and then I moved to London and discovered Capital Radio, that when I was a teenager, she was sort of blown away. What do you mean? I said when I told her I grew up with only 3 TV channels. I mean, she thinks I basically grew up in the Victorian age. The world is so different now, and the choice is so great now. And again, this idea that they're the only people providing local news. One of the reasons they're only reason that the organisation is providing local news is because they've completely swept away any chance of any commercial news because they've got such big budgets from their newsrooms. They're able to do that. And one of the main issues here is that they could just take take it down to news and documentaries, some great drama, and get it down to a much smaller cohort that they do it really, really well. Neutral news, please, fact-based. I want some serious good documentaries. I mean, Panorama Horizon used to be absolute must-watch. I mean, frankly, dumbed down nonsense, an awful lot of it right now. They really could go back to their core and win the British public back, but they don't need £3.5 billion of your and my money under threat of prison to do it.
That's exactly the case. And it's become a bloated institution. It's become an arrogant institution. It's become a slightly out of control institution. There is a lot of truth in that. And Nadine Dorries has made some good points about that. And I think it does need to be trimmed down. I think most people would like to see a publicly funded broadcaster that was honest, that was serious, that treated the public as adults, rather than this bloated institution, which is making far too much stuff, much of it which is quite hectoring and boring.
Indeed.
So it needs to have a reckoning with itself, sort out its identity crisis, and justify itself to the public.
Absolutely. Can I also ask you about the vote in the House of Lords last night? The Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill going through the House of Lords. Peers have voted down a number of the key measures, particularly regarding the ban on protests that are considered to be too noisy and too disruptive. Again, who gets to decide what is too noisy and what is too disruptive? Do you welcome that move by the House of Lords?
I'm so torn on this because, on the one hand, I'm really worried about the government's attack on the right to protest, which I think is an absolutely essential right. But I'm also worried about the existence of the House of Lords, which I consider to be an anti democratic institution, which I don't think should have the right to pore over laws made by our elected representatives. So, this is the question. Do we want to live in an unfree country created by people we elected and can vote out? Or do we want to live in a freer country created for us by people we have no control over? That's a real dilemma, I think, for Democrats to face.
Yeah. I wish those weren't the only two choices right now. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Brendan O'Neill, Chief Political Writer at Spiked.